A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. If you need a website or a domain, go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase. That was Crickeath here in North Wales. Still is, I suppose. And I was having an absolute blast taking photos there because I'd never been prior to last week. It's only about an hour from where I live. But then it rained after about 45 minutes quite heavily, and that wouldn't have been a problem had I had a jacket. I didn't have a jacket, which is a cardinal sin here in Wales, and I should know. I've lived here a good proportion of my life. Anyway, doesn't matter. I shall go back at some point this summer and make a video there, and I'm excited to do so. In the meantime, though, I want to talk about something I've been thinking about a lot recently, and even more so since listening to a podcast. Do I look like I'm really tiny? My chair was squeaking a lot, so I've swapped it for a stool, and I'm conscious that this desk looks massive. Does it? I think it's fine. So the podcast in question was Colin and Samir's podcast. You may have come across it. And they were interviewing Jacob Collier, who is a very talented musician and seems like a very interesting guy as well. And very early on in this podcast episode, he mentioned something he called the fatigue of bright packaging. And the context that I've been thinking about this concept in is things like, I find it very interesting that me and lots of other people would prefer in many cases to be watching YouTube content as opposed to Netflix content. And that's interesting given the delta between production values, budgets, all that kind of stuff. But I find this stuff especially interesting when it comes to photography. And basically today, what I want to briefly talk about is this fatigue of bright packaging, how that relates to our relationship with reality, and how perfectionism and something I'm going to call volume interact with those things. Probably makes absolutely no sense, so let me try and explain myself. Okay, so here's a photo that I shot in Cornwall last week or the week before, and you might have seen it if you follow me on Instagram or if you watched one of the last videos. And I like it for a few reasons. For example, I like how the netting reflects the tones and the colours in the rest of the photo. And even outside of that, I just think it's a really interesting subject. And this is obviously how I chose to shoot it. And I certainly don't mind the framing. I quite like that. I've got these buoys halfway up the top portion of the fence. And the trailer is sat between these two middle posts, which I think works quite well also. But in the past, I think a lot of the time, I would have immediately, as soon as I'd seen this photo, got rid of this post here, because I just think it's potentially distracting. So I'd have done something like that. And I don't know, long term, maybe that's the version I will go with. But I'm noticing these days that I'm having lots of conversation with myself about whether or not that's necessary or beneficial for the photo. And typically the question that I'm asking myself is, does this striving for perfectionism make the photo appear less real? Similar story with this one, which I also took in Cornwall. I took great care to make sure that I got this man sweeping right between the lamppost and this rail here. Also, I've stood in a place where this sign up here is between this chunk of land, this cliff, and this wall here. And in the past, there is no question that I'd have done some cloning down here, and I'd have certainly got rid of this power line up here in the top left-hand corner. But again, I'm spending a lot of time these days asking myself if that adds to the photo or removes some of the realism, and therefore some of the connection that people seem to get from realism. Now, if you've seen lots of my photos over the past year or so, this is something that you might notice. This one in New York, for instance, I could have easily made sure that this patch of tarmac that's not got ice on it, I could have cloned that to have some ice on it. And you could certainly make an argument that that would make this part of the image much less distracting, and you could focus on what I actually wanted you to focus on. But would it have made the shot a bit less real? Maybe. I don't know. And there are no right and wrong answers here. But having the debate with myself, I think, has been really beneficial. Same story with this one. I shot in Patagonia last month. I used quite a small aperture, f9, and I did so because I wanted everything reasonably sharp. I wanted you to be able to see what these benches were. And by the way, I just love that the tones and colours of these rugs mirror the horses. I think that's awesome. And this frame obviously mirrors the black horses, which I just love as well. But because I used quite a small aperture, and because the window isn't the cleanest, you can see lots of imperfections on the window, lots of dirt here. And in the past, no question, I'd have been doing lots of little intricate clones to make sure that I got rid of these marks. But same story, nowadays, I'm questioning whether it actually adds to the photo to have these, what you might consider imperfections in it. So yeah, this idea applies quite logically to things like blemishes and stuff that can be cloned, but I think it also applies to some of the rules that we talk about in photography as well, such as the rule of space. Now, I've spoken on this channel before about the rule of space, but basically it dictates that if you have something moving in your scene, it should have more space to move into than space behind it. So for example, if you've got an object that's moving left to right in your scene, you want to make sure that it's more on the left-hand side of the image than the right-hand side of the image, and vice versa. And by that standard, this photo that I took in Patagonia again of Rick could be stronger because you could have him moving to the left from the right-hand side of the image. And if I'd done that, or if Rick had moved the other way, or if I'd flipped him around in this photo in Photoshop, whatever, the photo would look a lot more textbook. But one of the things I'm finding these days that draws me to photos is if they don't look textbook. Now, I'm a bit conscious that so far this message is coming across as always make sure that your images are less than perfect. And that's not really what I mean. For instance, this photo, I have cropped to try and make it a bit more perfect. So this was the original, and you can see at the bottom, if I have the original, this wave just kind of cuts across the bottom of the photo in quite an ugly way, I think. And I have chosen in the final photo to therefore get rid of that. Therefore, there's no question, I'm trying to perfect the photo by doing that. The important thing is that you have this debate with yourself about what you should do, as opposed to always just assuming that the more perfect version is the best version. Now you'll notice that all of the photos that I've shown so far, plus most of the photos I've taken this year so far, or certainly shown, have been taken outside of golden hours. And that's for a few reasons. Sometimes I find that really good light can just be overpowering for a subject and you end up losing the interest in the subject because there's so much interest in the light. But I also think it's largely because I've been thinking about this concept of realism. And the reality is that we spend much more time seeing the world without golden light. And that to me is less about perfection and more about this other strand that impacts reality that I'm going to call volume, because I can't think what else to call it. So if you're anything like me, sometimes you're in the mood to listen to drum and bass, heavy metal, busy, loud music, basically. And other times you'll be in the mood for much calmer stuff. And I've noticed over the past couple of years that I'm much the same with photography, both taking photos and viewing the photos of others. And sometimes I'm in the mood to see what I'd call really loud images. Basically photos that shout for your attention. You know, golden hour, incredible vistas. Again, absolute textbook perfection. But increasingly, what I find I'm interested in is photos that are calmer. Photos that don't necessarily shout for your attention, but they probably do more than whisper. They just talk to you. Normal. Again, volume, I'm not sure is the right word. But in short, I think light plays a big part in that. And I've noticed that lots of photographers who I look up to are very skilled in taking photos at all kinds of different volumes. And they're not wholly reliant on taking photos that are loud in their nature, that shout for your attention. I don't know if that makes sense at all, but if you follow any of my work, you may have noticed some of this stuff, the lack of perfection and my attempts to produce photos that are in some ways quieter than others. And what I've been talking about is why, I suppose. And I've talked a lot in the past on this channel, I think, from memory, about the difficulty of teaching photography because it's a mixture of art and science. And it's very easy to teach the science, the apertures, the ISOs, the shutter speeds, because you're dealing with black and white there. You're dealing with fact and the capturing of light. But comparatively, it's very difficult to teach the art. Everything that's based in taste and personal perspective. It's very difficult to teach that stuff, but it's much more important, I think, than apertures and ISOs. A, because it has a much bigger impact on your work, and B, because taste, or an understanding of your taste, is vital to be able to robustly defend your work. So yeah, anyway, just some stuff I've been thinking about. Hopefully that made some sort of sense. I'm never confident that my videos make sense, even less so in this one. But anyway, yeah, hopefully it was interesting. And also a big thank you to the sponsor of this week's video, Squarespace. And on my Squarespace website, there is a blog and a new blog post where I've done my very best to try and summarise some of these thoughts. Probably muddled it up even more, but please go and check that out. And if you would like your own Squarespace website, I would highly recommend one to all photographers as somewhere to showcase your best work, but also as a place to talk about some of your best work in the form of a blog, or even sell some of your best work through an online store. For me, Squarespace has fantastic solutions for photographers of all kinds. And if you're interested in checking it out, you can do so for free by going to squarespace.com to start your free trial. And after that, if you'd like to make a purchase, just go to squarespace.com/James and you'll get 10% off your first purchase. So yeah, a big thank you to them for their continued support, and thank you to you for watching.